Hey guys. I don't know if you can hear my toddler throwing his blocks everywhere. Good times. Check that out. Cutie. Anyways, I found this app thing that's going to let me record myself and also show you the PowerPoint at the same time. So I'm going to use it, but it only lets me record in 5-minute chunks. So 5-minute chunks it is. So we are on Standard 13, Domain 3. This is some of this stuff we already talked about in class. I'm going to go over the stuff that we talked in class just real fast, and then I'll go on to the new stuff. So we started with talking about kind of the, sorry, got to get some Play-Doh out for my child. So we started talking about the consequences of big business. So all those like railroads and Rockefeller and the Industrial Revolution and all that stuff. We're looking at some of the results, the effects of that, and how people are starting to try to reform that. We call it the progressive era. So we talked about muckrakers. Those are investigative journalists who expose corruption or problems. So like Upton Sinclair, remember we said that he went undercover into this meatpacking industry and just saw how incredibly dangerous and unsanitary the conditions were there. And he wrote about it. And so people get really upset about this and they start to demand that the government does something. So the government passes the Meat Inspection Act. They create the FDA to inspect our food, and that's still around. And then we have Ida Tarbell, who focused on big business. So she looked at Rockefeller and all the stuff that he was doing, and she said, the way he's running his business is corrupt. So she writes the history of the Standard Oil Company, and it's going to lead people to believe, you know what, maybe the government does need to get involved and do something about these monopolies. And then we talked also about Jacob Riis, who was a photojournalist. So he went into the inner cities and he was looking at all of the things that were going on there. Remember, this is before the time of things like sewer systems or trash pickup or anything like that. And so he's looking at the living conditions and photographing them and showing people this is how unhealthy it is to live in the city, especially if you're poor. So this is going to lead to things like the municipal housing codes and creation of sanitation departments and all of those good things. So then this is where we got to in class. So this should be new stuff for everyone. So we're talking about women in the reform movements. So if you remember from way back when, like way back in Jacksonian democracy, we talked about some of these reform movements and how women were so heavily involved in them. Well, they're involved again in these reform movements. So there's a reborn temperance movement, which remember is getting rid of alcohol. Again, they are really pushing for women's suffrage, for voting rights for women. And they are focusing on things like sanitation and educational reforms and child labor. They're really focusing on all of these things. So they specifically looked at the lives of the urban poor, especially immigrant women and children. So remember, these are women, so they have the education and health of their children to think about. And so that's what they're kind of focusing on. One of those in particular was named Jane Addams. It is spelled with 2 Ds, which is really weird, but that's not a typo. So Jane Addams founded the Settlement House movement. So she created something called the Whole House. And what the Whole House was, is it was, imagine like a YMCA, but way back when, 1889. So it had like a playground and a daycare and a preschool, and it had like a coffee house and a library, and it would be a school for adults after they got off work. And so basically she's looking at all of these problems in the inner city, and she says, Jane Addams says, I'm going to create a place to help fix some of these problems. So she provided this place that was supposed to really focus on the inner city and improving their lives and the way they live there. So she also focused on other things like child labor and healthcare and immigration and those types of things. So we would consider her a progressive. So